time for
Wow.
Q&A.
And while we're waiting for our guests to pose a question, is it okay if I ask a question, Jane? Would you be open to that? Would that be all right?
Yeah.
You know, in the beginning of your talk, you spoke about so many people being affected by COVID, whether we're affected by the loss of a loved one or the loss of income or the loss of freedom, the loss of, for a lot of our young people, the loss of a social life, education, things that things that people hold dear. And I'm wondering if you could perhaps give a little bit of advice to the helpers, the counselors, who inevitably have their own story of grief and loss that they are holding whilst trying to journey alongside their loved one, the people around them, their clients, the church members. I mean, in what ways, what advice can you give to the counselor themselves while they're journeying with their own grief alongside someone who's also experiencing grief?
Yeah. Thanks, Candida. That's a great question. I think that if we're uncomfortable with grief ourselves, it's going to make us hard to walk alongside those who grieve. And certainly as biblical counselors, we don't stand above or beyond those who we are walking alongside. We're not the experts. Like I said at the beginning, I don't have all the answers. I have a lot of learning and growing to do. And so I think that it's a wonderful opportunity for us to dig deeper into our own hearts and our own faith and to bring that before the Lord. Because as we saw with Jesus, you know, he is one who himself has suffered. He entered into this world as a man. He has walked that journey. And so I think that people who've not experienced the loss of a loved one, like a really close loss, they can counsel others who've lost someone, but there is a depth and a compassion and an understanding that gets added to that when we have experienced that ourselves, and know what that looks like. And so I'd say don't switch off to your own grief. Don't ignore it. Don't bury it. Like, if you're wanting to help others and walk alongside them, be willing to engage your own grief and to walk that journey yourself with the Lord Jesus Christ and with those around you, and then helping others with that process and that journey. And so I obviously when I'm counseling, I don't want to share my story of grief in a way that I'm breaking down and the person in front of me feels like they need to counsel me, right? So I need to have processed enough that I am able to, like, my objective is to be there for them, and my sharing is very relying on the Holy Spirit, but also very discerning in terms of what I share when and how, and the reason why I'm sharing. In other words, just to help them in a particular part of their process, to make them aware that they're not alone, to help normalize, like, you know, that it's absolutely normal to struggle with questions or to not be able to remember things or find your keys because you're grieving, or not be able to study if you're a student. So to share, to normalize, and to help them with that process, and then to pull back, but the focus then is still on them and their grief, and walking alongside them in that journey.
Yeah, thank you for that. This coming alongside theme has come up significantly through your whole presentation, specifically the coming alongside on the Emmaus journey, that there was a blindness during their grief. And very often there is blindness when we're grieving that requires somebody to walk alongside for a long period of time. And so I see the beauty in the depth and the journey. And if I'm hearing you correctly, that's a big part of this model. And Naomi has asked some quite pertinent questions there. She's interested in knowing, how successful has this model been with children and teens? Have you experienced that much?
No, that's an area I haven't pushed into, but I know that it is greatly needed. It's definitely something that I do want to look to doing in the future, because there are a lot of children and teens struggling with the loss of parents from COVID, and or other situations and circumstances, or siblings, that sort of thing. But yeah, to answer your question, I haven't really pushed into that area in a significant way at this point. But I would imagine that it would be helpful. It would need to be tailored to their specific needs. But I think because the method also is narrative-based and story-based, it will be somewhat accommodating of it, because we get them to share their stories of loss. And it's not just information coming their way, that there is certainly the opportunity to hear what they are particularly struggling with. But there's definitely work that I would like to do in the future in working with children and teens.
Right. So just for the sake of the moderator, my chat box has deleted all the messages that just came through, so perhaps they could just work on that for me in the meantime. But yeah. I did notice a few before they all happened to disappear. And someone posed, I'm sorry that I didn't remember the name, but someone was asking about the story of Job and how useful it is in a counseling situation to use the story of Job when working with somebody who is grieving. Their experience has been a little bit it hasn't been as effective. What is your take on the story of Job in a grief counseling situation?
Yeah, so I think more than anything else, the story of Job is the idea there is to help them understand that there is a bigger story at play, and so it doesn't necessarily mean they need to identify with Job's story, or that their suffering is necessarily innocent, or that you don't want to draw direct parallels too much necessarily with Job. But it's more just the idea of that we do ask questions, we do struggle through grief. It's helpful in terms of also just understanding for comforters, that as those who comfort his friends are seeking to understand why Job is suffering, and in making assumptions, the assumptions that they make bring almost more harm and distress to him than the suffering itself. We often have in grief where you've lost your loved one and you're dealing with that, but then on top of that, you're dealing with people's responses to the death of your loved one, or the things that they say, or the things that they're assuming. And that can be really challenging and hard and frustrating at times. Yeah. When people just don't meet you in your grief where you are at that particular point in time.
So I very much appreciate you saying that. And I remember in your presentation, you mentioned the 7 days of sitting in silence maybe being the most appropriate time for someone's reflection. And I think too often as counselors, we forget that we're not the experts in someone else's story, and that they are a story in another story already. And that to be a witness to that and be present in that moment becomes the greatest part of that journey, wouldn't you say? So someone earlier also asked, which I thought was quite a profound question, what happens when somebody isn't a believer? These 8, if we can still call them steps, I know we'll be cautious with the model and try to respect that, but what happens when someone is not a believer and yet they are requiring a journey with a counselor and you happen to be the person that's in that space? Can you speak into that for us a little bit, please?
Yeah, so Candida, I have the privilege of working under the church in a church context, which when somebody comes to me, they know that. and I unapologetically come from a Christian perspective. And so I would, if I know someone's not a believer, I would be asking them, first just kind of sharing with them my approach to counseling. And, are they comfortable with that this model, that the approach that I'm bringing is coming very clearly from a Christian perspective, from a biblical perspective. And if they're not comfortable, then I will refer them on to somebody that they are comfortable with. When I piloted the course in the States, there were two people who weren't believers, and they were encouraged to come on the course by believers. And I said to them, I'm absolutely fine having them. I'm happy to have them, but please be upfront with them about what it is that they're coming to. And we just checked and clarified that, and they were absolutely fine with it. And then as we journeyed through the course with one of the ladies, she kept engaging and just apologizing that her knowledge of the scriptures wasn't as good, but she was willing to read them. She was willing to engage. She was, kind of just growing and learning. And afterwards, she joined one of the ladies for some one-on-one discipleship. So I think, so there are courses that are geared more towards, that will soften the Christian aspect and will be geared a little more towards reaching those who do not know Christ. And those are helpful. But I also think that it's really important when we're talking about soul-satisfying comfort. When people are grieving, even if they don't know Jesus, even if they're not Christians, they are asking questions that can only really be answered by the death and resurrection of Christ, and that the comfort that comes from that is the deepest, most satisfying comfort. They are asking those questions already anyway, and so as long as they upfront know and are willing to engage, I don't think that there's a problem. You just need to be real and give them the opportunity to be there or not be there.
Right. That's that authenticity that comes with being prepared to be there, being prepared to be uncomfortable together, being prepared to do the journey from wherever they're at forward towards Christ-likeness, even if the starting point is, I don't know Christ yet. And so I think that answers a couple of other questions that people are asking too, where there is that discomfort, that uncomfortable space you mentioned, where people are again, not against God, but questioning, does God even exist if he's allowing this to happen? How does somebody who loves the Lord so much get taken home when we were all praying? And they lose their faith in the prayer part. And one of the fundamental steps, or one of the important steps, significant steps, is praying with this person. If they've lost their faith in prayer, or lost their faith in Christ, and prayer is no longer significant to them, how might we do that step? Is there another way or another tool that we can help them through with in that environment?
So one of the things that I find often is people are angry at God when they've lost a loved one, Christians and non-Christians alike, and to kind of say that that's okay. There are many people who can't go to church for months afterwards, who are strong believers and just can't even go into church. For me, I went straight back to church, but I can tell you, sitting in in a chair, seeing couples in front of me and not having Stephen by my side was really hard. And so even as believers, being in the presence of God's people can be really hard at times. And praying to God can be like, I don't even want to talk to you, God. And so I encourage those I'm counseling, well, just tell them that. That's okay. Hey, God, I don't want to talk to you. I'm really angry. God can handle our anger. He can handle our doubts and our questions. And we can pray on their behalf. And just that reminding them that if they are believers, that the Holy Spirit is groaning for them, that Jesus is praying for them. Like, when you're ready, that's okay. Then, let me know. And if you want me to pray with you at any point, I'm happy to do that. In the meantime, know that I am praying for you. And I can relate to and I can understand that it's really hard to do that at this time. And so when I counsel, I always invite people to pray. I normally open in prayer, and I'll often, almost always, invite the person to close in prayer, but I'll never force them or push them. But I will keep inviting, and inevitably at some point they pray. They're ready for it.
I keep hearing you say things that remind us as counselors to be where the person is at. Mm-hmm. Join them in the journey they are in. Spend time with them, sometimes in silence. If they're not ready to pray, that prayer is then something that we invite them into, and if they're not in that space, we don't push. Mm. For me, this model that you're sharing with us today really invites us into a rhythm with somebody, and they're setting the pace. And I might even venture to say that the Holy Spirit is setting the pace in their life, wherever that's at, and our job is to join them in that. And I appreciate that you keep bringing us back to that. So thank you for that. Jose would like to ask a question himself, to verbalize it himself. So Jose, would you like to unmute and present your question to Jane at this time?
Candida, Jose doesn't have a microphone. Jose, in order to join us with audio, you need to click on the little telephone and join with audio.
Right, I'll wait to see when that happens. And in the meantime, we'll go on to another question. Jose, I'll come back to you. And thank you for that. That was our moderator. We will applaud that too. Our assistance from the behind the scenes. Someone has, Idaletia is posing the question, which I think we looking at a similar answer, but it's lovely to hear it again and hear what your view is on it. She says, in the case of someone who's been stuck in grief for years, having become very negative, always talking about the loss, not seeming able to move on or enjoy life at all, what would your take be for the counseling or the caregiver or the helper or the family member that's coming alongside that person? How would you speak into that one?
Yeah. With counseling, it's always hard to answer these questions when you don't have the person in front of them, because as a counselor, I'd have a bunch of other questions. But just, I think one of the things that we can believe when we've lost someone is that if we stop grieving, it means we've forgotten them and they're no longer alive or part of our journey and our story. And that's not true. So through the first year of my grief, pretty much every day, Stephen was on my mind, and I constantly had this underlying deep sorrow. And even at times where there was a little bit of joy, it was always tainted by that. And I was very aware every day of Stephen's absence during those years. Now, much less so. And it doesn't mean that he's not important to me or that I love him any less than I did, through those years that we were together. So that would be one thing that could possibly be at play. Just kind of feeling like to keep them alive, or to let them go. There would be guilt if I didn't think about them every day or talk about them every day or stay in my sorrow. There could be a whole lot of other reasons for being stuck in grief. Sometimes, when we're grieving, we can get a lot of attention and love and care from others, and it can be hard to let go of that too. And so wanting to, kind of keep those relationships going or keep that love and care coming seems crazy, but in a way that could be part of it. And then there could be a whole lot of other reasons. I had one person I was counseling when I was in the States who was a single woman, had never married. She was, I think, in her mid to late 30s. her brother was married, and she'd lost both her parents quite a few years before. And her grief looked as if it was as fresh as it had happened a month or two before. And part of that for her was the struggle, because she now was not part of an immediate family anymore. So even though she had a brother who was married, you're still not part of that intimate, immediate family. And she wasn't married, didn't have like a future and a purpose and children and others to look after to be part of that family. And so I think that was a part of her struggle, was that because she was still single, it made it that much harder for her to let go of the grief with her parents.
Right. Thank you for that. I hope that answers your question, Idaleta. I like that question because it also invites us to be more open to the situation, that every situation is unique. And there might be more at play with the stuckness, that it could be a meaning and purpose, an existential crisis. There's so many things that are surrounding the grief situation. And so I like what you're saying now. We actually need to be a little bit more aware of what else might be at play as counselors, and not just box somebody into the grief box and say, well, this is just, like you said before, we mustn't do the 8 steps. Here they are, and off we go. It's a compassionate, let the spirit lead, see where people are at truly in their story and join them there. And I mean, thankfully we have the Spirit of God to help us with that we're not sitting trying to be heroic in that moment with our clients or hurting person.
Yeah. And Candida, that's why I also call them relational steps, because it brings in that relationship, that engaging people, seeing where they're at. So we always want to shorten things and drop things out, but I'm quite intentional about the word relational in there, so that we are doing.
Thank you for that, Jane, and a reminder to all of us, let's hold the word relational. I've written it all over my notes and I still didn't use it. Did you notice? So I appreciate that. It looks like, Jose, you've got your audio back. Would you like to pose a question at this time, and then we will see if we can do 1 or 2 more. We are running short of time, but if you don't mind, Jose.
Thank you, Candida. Thank you, Jane, for a wonderful presentation. I don't know if it was, I wasn't at the beginning, so I don't know if it's Dr. Kratz. If it is, apologies.
No, it's
my question is about, in the process of grieving, often what may transpire is that a situation of clinical pathology begins to emerge in terms of depression. I mean, where does your course begin and end in terms of that break? Because it is almost such a fine point that unless you are a well-trained person in this field, you may not be able to observe it. So can you take us through that point where your course is helpful, and then the patient may need other levels of clinical psychology because the problem has become pathological, and even psychiatry help? Can you maybe describe a bit of that for us? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I do have some training on the clinical side up to honours level some years ago. I think what's really helpful to remember is that it is normal for grief to look a lot like depression. I think that it can be hard to distinguish those when somebody is grieving. And if I remember correctly, the DSM-5, I think, I can't remember for sure now if we're on 5 or 6. It keeps on growing and changing over the years. You could probably help me more on that, Jose and others. But it doesn't allow a lot of time before it will begin to define clinical depression. So I think, if I remember correctly, it's something like 6 months, 3 months or 6 months. And obviously, you look at a number of factors in terms of how much the person is struggling, or, dealing with depression in the midst of this. But in my personal experience and in working with others, the first 2 years is really tough on a very close loss. So a mother, a father, a child, a husband, a wife. in that immediate family, or in the African context, it could be an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother, because Gogo is the one who raised me and not my mom. So in those immediate sort of family contexts, it's a year to 2 years before you begin to experience a little bit more joy and less of the sorrow. So to say after 3 months or 6 months, as society often expects, that we'll be over it, I think is premature. If somebody is really struggling hugely and has been through the course and continues to really struggle, or there are complicated factors and there needs to be a referral for additional help, or there are other physiological factors involved, if the person needs to be checked out by a doctor or referred, then there's no harm. In fact, there's good in doing that, and at least in consulting those specialists, and then continuing to journey alongside them, if they are Christians, to journey alongside them as they see somebody else as well. Not just to let them go and say, okay, now they're in the hands of somebody else and the faith part no longer has a role or is important. So, Jose, I don't know if I've answered you fully, but I've done the best that I can in terms of your question.
Jane, I think one thing that you said that you may not have realized it was significant advice is when you said, I am not a clinical psychologist and blah, blah, blah. And that's really important for us as Christian counselors to remember, that we have a scope of practice. We need to be responsible with our training and our equipping in the fields that we are allowed to practice in, and to be aware that there are spaces that we should really be partnering with clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists for certain situations. Like you said before, we're about the soul comfort, the depth of that. And so if we are fully aware of what's going on around us, and that we are actually walking on holy ground, aren't we, when we are journeying with clients and with people who are hurting. And so I really appreciate that you've emphasized again the responsibility we have to partner with other professionals when it's necessary, like Jose was saying, when it goes pathological. So thank you for bringing that out as well. There were a few questions mentioned that I think you've touched on. Naomi was saying, what happens when a loved one has passed and the family was not able to be there during that time? Specifically with COVID, we've seen that most of the COVID deaths have happened separate from being able to be present there. And I don't know if we can combine that in some way with what Francis is saying, this lamenting. Is it combining, is it the lamenting part where those sorts of stories need to be allowed to be real and be, not trying to, like you say, not trying to relieve the grieving, but to be in the grieving when something as extreme as not having been with the person is there. Can you add a bit to that for those two people, perhaps, please?
Yeah, I think COVID and all the regulations around it add, just that complicating factor, that hugely complicating factor. It really is exceptionally hard not to be present, and to be able to be there for our loved ones and with them when they pass, or, just in, I can't even begin to imagine. I have a small inkling, but I can't begin to imagine how hard that is. But I think that there are ways of processing that and dealing with that. Technology is never sufficient or complete, but the blessing is that, in this day and age, we have, platforms like this one that we're on, and Zoom and WhatsApp video calls. And so in some ways, I think people have been able to have a greater measure of engagement with loved ones than might have been the case, 100 years ago, or when they had the Spanish flu, whenever that was, that there was, that has helped hugely. So there is that, but also, there are plenty of people who die in a car accident suddenly, and you have no time with the person before they die or contact. And so And so it's not unique to COVID to not have that engagement. And there are ways in which we can process that. At the end of the course that I offer, we have what I call a celebration of life evening, the last week. And there we open the space and provide the opportunity for those who've been through the course, journeying through the course, to come together. Before COVID, it would have been with a meal, if it's in a safe context in which to have a meal. Stephen loved pizza, so I would take a pizza along, and somebody else's husband or wife might have loved making banana bread, and so we would share a meal that was meaningful to us in relation to the ones we'd lost. And then we light candles in memory of them, so have little tea light candles, and we get to light a candle in memory of each of the loved ones that we've lost. We light, as Christians, we also light the Christ candle to remind us of the presence of Christ and his involvement. And then we also allow people to bring either a photograph or a treasured item that belonged to their loved one. And each person gets the platform for 10 or 15 minutes to tell us about what they've brought about, and we get to know their loved one. And that's really what a memorial service does, what a funeral does, that those are rites or rituals. Those are ways in which we bring closure to things that don't feel like that, when there isn't closure. They're all important parts of processing life and death and loss. And then helping people to deal with the regrets, to deal with those things. And you can I made a blanket. My mom-in-law and we made a beautiful blanket with some photographs. Those kinds of things. You can find beautiful ways of just remembering and bringing the presence of your loved one into your daily life. Having a nice collage of photographs I've got one at the end of my passage here, that when I walk past there, I can see the day that Stephen and I got married and just be reminded he's still present with me in that way, and stirs up the memories and the joy of the good times that we had together as well. So not just remembering death, but I think a big part is remembering the life, however many years that was. The death is significant, it's massive, it's important, but there's a much bigger period of time that was their life and time spent with them, and we need to be remembering the joys as well.
I was hoping you'd bring up the celebration part of this model. I had, just to let you all know, I had the privilege of talking to Jane yesterday already, so I got to hear this part. And I think in Christianity, very often we are maybe a bit uncomfortable with the concept of rituals, and we maybe fear the options that are out there. And the way you have presented it has given us the time to think about, what does communion look like? And if we were in communion with someone while they were living, that means there's a part of them, the Ubuntu concept, I am because you are, and we are because we're together, and we carry that with us. We're not separate from that. And so the rituals you're speaking of, where you bring something that was important to that person, which makes part of their story part of our story, because we have to continue, and we have to continue in relationship with others. And I just want to commend you and your mother-in-law for this beautiful piece of artwork that you put together as a community, as a communion for Christ. It's beautiful, the relationship development that has happened around that word celebration in your 9th week of the model. I don't know if you want to add a little bit more to that, or do you feel comfortable that enough has been said in that remarkable space of celebrating life?
Yeah, I think I've pretty much covered that one. Okay.
Okay. Then if we can just, we only have a few minutes left, and Rob posed the question quite a number of minutes ago, and I was thinking, should we throw it in or not? But I'm wondering about extending the grieving model into other areas. For example, in our global climate, where there's a lot of division Do we take a vaccination? Do we not take a vaccination? Are you a mask wearer? Are you not a mask wearer? Speaking specifically of COVID. In the United States, the political division that's happened straight down the center of families around the COVID politics. I don't want to get into the COVID politics as much as the anxiety and the division that some families are experiencing. And I'm wondering if there's a certain grieving towards healing journey that maybe counselors could take utilizing some of these steps. It's a huge question, I know, but off the top of your head, do you think can we extend this model into other areas, do you think?
I'd probably have to give that a lot more thought.
Yeah, exactly. I think so too. Rob is good at posing questions that make us think, I have to admit.
Yeah, but I do think one of the things that you mentioned there was just sort of anxiety and division. So one of the things that's important to be aware of is that grief is never just grief. There is so much more going on in our hearts and minds as we're grieving. There are fears and anxieties. One of the greatest anxieties we face is the fear of our own death, because we're suddenly faced with our mortality, or the fear of engaging relationally in our families, because we know that when we lose them, that we are going to suffer pain, because we've experienced that now with one other member. And so there's a lot more going on than just grief when we're dealing with those who are grieving. And on the division side, that happens even at the family level. Where relationships were poor before the death of a loved one in a family unit, they get even worse as people's fears kind of really come to the fore, or people squabble over inheritance, or whatever it is. Now the matriarch or the patriarch isn't there, and suddenly now, there's no one holding the family together. There's no glue holding the family together. And so one of the things that I do cover in the course is a little bit on relational breakdown and relational difficulties, because that is such a big thing. And that obviously expands out, with COVID, as Rob has suggested, into other areas of dealing with, sort of, are you for or against masks or vaccination and all of that. And those are important questions that we need to be thinking through and applying the gospel to. I definitely think that there is, in the scriptures and in the gospel, ways to navigate those. Whether this model specifically will help with that, I'm not sure. I'd have to think a little more about that. But great question.
Thank you for that answer. That was a really impressed. That was right on the spot, and so that was an unfair question that you fielded beautifully. And again, coming back to walking on holy ground, we need to be aware that this is a journey with somebody. There's a lot more going on than what we can possibly imagine, that we are close to the Lord ourselves, and being led by the Spirit as we care for people, and not trying to be the expert in their story. So, Jane, I really appreciate your time today and your sharing. I think it's very courageous of you to bring your own personal story into a model of training where you are needing to hold space and be held simultaneously. That's tough stuff. Yeah. And so before our closing prayer, are there any closing comments, Jane, before we wrap up, that you just feel there was a couple of things you just really needed to say before we move from the space? Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I'm just very thankful for the opportunity to share, and thankful for all the questions that have come my way, because it's, like I said, I'm not the expert. It's challenges and sharpens me and grows me as well. So I'm really thankful for your questions, and just looking forward to continuing to see what the Lord does in and through me and through others as they walk alongside those who are grieving.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. And I'd also want to just thank you to all of our listeners and audience viewers today for participating and being present. The journey we get to do with the Lord is with others. There's no way around that. Every Christian is called to walk alongside people. So every time we have the opportunity to learn from one another, let's do that. Let's commit to being in the Lord's hand so that we can hold other people's hands.